here.
We're looking at the same thing. That was going to be my concern, but yeah, we're looking at the same thing. Perfect.
Okay, so here we go, and we are live on YouTube, and then this, of course, becomes a podcast. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Jason Green. And Jason is a community organizer, attorney, storyteller, and entrepreneur who served as special assistant to the president and associate White House counsel to President Obama, advising on economic and domestic policy matters. He is the co-founder of SkillSmart, a company that reshapes how communities measure economic impact, and is CEO of Evergreen Labs, where he supports visionary organizations working to expand economic opportunity and strengthen community. And he's also the author of a wonderful new book right here that I'm looking at in front of me that is marked up, and we'll talk about it, called Too Precious to Lose, a Member of Family, Community, and Possibility. And so this being In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, I'm going to ask you to please subscribe on YouTube right now, if that's where you're watching, because that helps us. And also to note that this is a podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and to go there. And please subscribe also to my Substack page, It Has to Be Said, which is where I do my commentaries at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And you can follow my new project at thegospelofzip.com, or go to YouTube and watch the whole thing for free, since I read it, all 8 hours of it, out loud. So literally, we're only trying to sell you Jason's book today, not mine. Mine's free. It's also on Amazon and Kindle and in paperback. And you can support us by making a tax-deductible donation at georgebailey.org. So, Jason, I read this book today, and the first thing I want to show you is that, unlike all these flakes and fakers who will interview you on this book, I actually read your book. There's the dog-eared pages. Do you see the marked pages?
I love
Every,
it, Frank.
every single one has a note on it. Every single one is marked. And I get up early in the morning. I finished reading this book at about 11 a.m., marked it up, and went through it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just reading some things. I'm going to ask you to read some stuff too. But I want you to read this aloud to us. So would you start this interview by reading your author's note, which is literally at the beginning of the book? It's about a page and a half just before the prologue. If you would read that to us, it will get us into the discussion. Do you mind doing that?
I happily will. And let me say thank you, Frank, for having me on. I'm just excited to be in conversation with you.
It's a real pleasure. And genuinely, you're going to see I'm very enthusiastic about this book. And as we go through, I'm picking out things I love about it, and we'll be talking about it. So let me just say right up front to anybody listening, I'm a huge fan of Jason's book, of his grandmother, of his story, of his life. And, I found this moving and touching and wonderful, and a terrific read, sort of like a glass of fresh water when I was thirsty. It comes at a good time. I really love this book.
Thank you, Frank.
So please read your author's note.
Author's note. In 1967, Dr. King, in his final book, asked, "Where do we go from here? Chaos or community?" For the longest time, I assumed the answer was obvious: community. We would choose one another. We would build and progress together. That was what I was taught and grew up believing. But now I understand why Dr. King posed his prophetic question, and I worry. I worry about the rising tide of racial and political animus and how easily it turns us inward and on each other. I worry about a future rushing toward us, widening a gulf between the haves and the have-nots. I worry that profit eclipses humanity, dignity, and respect. I worry because it matters how we see each other and that we see each other. I worry because choosing community isn't as obvious as I once perhaps naively believed. Alas, almost 60 years later, most signs still point to chaos. I get it. Chaos is faster, louder, it gets more clicks. Community moves slowly. It demands more of us. It requires grace and intention. This book is about that kind of work, the kind that makes us slow down and truly remember. It was unexpected to walk into a room, to sit by my ailing 95-year-old grandmother's side, a blessing to walk out forever changed. I wrote this book as an enduring reminder that our collective yesterdays, no matter how troubled, light our path toward better tomorrows. and I choose community because some things are too precious to lose.
Yeah, I love that opening. And I want to jump into the next page, and I've got notes all the way through, but I want to read something that really brings us up to this moment, sort of ripped from the headlines, which is not why you wrote your book, but it's just very apropos of the moment we're in right now. In a nation mired in division, struggling to hold on to its very identity as a democracy, the birth of my first child was both a welcome distraction and a reminder of what truly mattered. And so, of course, that's the context for the whole book, because you put that early in the book and you have a young child right now. So that's of your moment. And I found the same thing with my children and my grandchildren in terms of sharpening my powers of observation because I really care about the moment we're in. And it's not a selfish caring, it's really for other people because I'm 73 at this point, not as old as your grandma got. But I'm looking back. And one thing that struck me about your book, reading about President Obama and your time in the White House, is there are literally days when I think of the Obama administration as if it was some sort of dream that happened in another lifetime because we seem so far from that now in so many terrible ways. And, just the other day, watching somebody get shot in the face and then someone else shot 10 times when they're on the ground, this would not have happened with Obama in office. But more than that, had a tragedy like that occurred, when
Right.
things like that happened, he stood there and sang Amazing Grace. And there was grace about that. And literally, when I've had tears in my eyes many times this year, and one of the things is just trying to remember the Obama era and say, did that really happen? Because it seems like it was a different country and a different humanity and a different set of things. So it must be very odd for you, having worked in the Obama administration, to be living through this moment, because it's not just the presidency has moved on or a different party is in power. It's as if we've moved to a different country. And I know that's not what your book's about. But I'd like to go there first in terms of your observations as someone who worked in the Obama administration. Forget your professional life as a human being. Um, it's like having grown up in a Caribbean island and now you've moved to Alaska. It's not just you've changed your address; you're in a whole other life. And I feel that as a layperson who wasn't part of the Obama administration, you must doubly just stare at the news some days and just say, where are we now? And I don't want to go somewhere you don't want to go, but I'm just throwing that out there because as I read your book, and I'm not going to talk a lot on this podcast, it's for you to do the talking, but I just want to tell you, I had such a surge, a passionate surge of nostalgia for the love you had for your grandmother, representing everything that I think is important in life. And then this kind of hard, cold moment saying, and we're so far from that in this country right now. And it really got to me. So you painted a picture of where we all want to live. And I'd sure like to know how to get back there. But I've said a lot. Now I'm going to throw it into, if you've got any thoughts on what I've been saying, go for it.
Oh, Frank, your passion on this comes through, and I appreciate it. I appreciate you digging into these pages and letting your reactions flow through. Uh, to, I spent 6 years uh, serving the Obama family, 2 years on the campaign, 4 years in the administration, and my only goal was to try and do what President or then Senator Obama said in his 2004 Democratic National Convention speech, right? I believed in this idea where there weren't red states and blue states. There were the United States. I mean, and that the beautiful thing about that is it was a rally cry for people to come together and support that idea. When we talk about people coming into politics, the migration of people to Washington to support that idea, the idea that you're talking about, right? That feels so far removed that we can actually reach across these aisles and build something better that includes all of us. So when you say that it doesn't exist and how do I feel, obviously it rips my heart out to see what's happening to the building. And I write about it a little bit about what happened to the building that I obviously worked in and loved, and more importantly than that, venerated, right? Like the office, the authority, the moral leadership that you're talking about that President Obama was able to show in times of crisis. I think about when he was at Mother Emanuel and sang Amazing Grace. We didn't get everything right in the administration, but I think that he imbued a pride in the country He certainly inspired an entire generation to participate in public service, not to denigrate it, not to. And so, one of the things that really struck me in going back to write this book, this was in some respects, the book was my own balm and salve to what you're talking about. And I found in going and stay with my grandmother, what I learned was we've been here before. America isn't this always up and to the right trajectory story. We have progress and we have backlash. We have progress and we have backlash. And so we had tremendous progress and we have backlash. And so the real question is, can we come together, and will we have the energy that after this moment of backlash to again, put forward tremendous progress and keep pushing, the country that you and I both dream about, back on course.
Yeah, you say again early in the book, and I've got a lot of stuff to go through here. Ever since I was a kid, all I wanted to do was something, anything that would make people's lives better. Growing up, I envied the friends who could articulate the exact job they wanted. That was never me. I didn't have a title in mind. I just knew I wanted my work to matter. And the White House mattered. You kind of set the whole thing up. One thing I was talking to my wife, Jeannie, about this morning after I read your book on a third or fourth cup of coffee, I said, this book is a good reminder for me. I grew up in Switzerland as the son of American missionary parents in the evangelical community there, which I left, and I've gone to a very different place intellectually and spiritually since then. But the kind of basic kindness of that community that was open to people stuck. And I found that very much with your grandmother. And one thing, and I think I have the quote underlined somewhere, but if I don't, you'll know what I'm talking about. Your grandmother's sort of ability to take life as it came and not dramatize over problems. Her saying, well, if you believe in God and do the right thing, things tend to work out. And that's sort of my philosophy. But what I told my wife this morning is I said, we're shocked because white people are getting shot in the face and a white guy gets killed. You have to understand, for the Black community, this is normal. This is what happens all the time with police brutality, how Black community has been treated in history, is at the present day. And that itself is a wake-up call to remind myself as I read your book that part of our shock at what Trump has done to, quote, us, that's the wider nation, white people included, comes because we, unlike your grandmother, have not lived through times in which tragically these things are quote unquote normal and how people are treated. So again, I want to get into the book specifically, but before I dive into that further, that's another general kind of question. And I'd like your observations on that. From your grandmother's life, your life, you have an incident toward the end of the book where someone's yelling the N-word at you and the kind of rage that you faced in that one time and so forth and so on. But just as an observer of our country, having worked in the White House, how do you square the fact that when you're talking to a white man who grew up in an evangelical community, you grew up in a church community, but my experience is not one of constant fear and persecution at traffic stops and all this other stuff. Your community it is. So what do you do with white people who look at our present moment of history and talk about fascism and totalitarianism because it's now applying to the white community when the Black community has been living in that environment since day one?
I think we sit in conversation, Frank. I mean, I take your point incredibly well, and I think it's often overlooked. The historical connections, to your point, are going to authoritarian Nazi Germany and not to trying to repress the civil rights movement, where you saw that sort of violence take place on American soil, right? And so it's part of why we tell these stories. This is my point about this book talks about the beauty of community, but it also talks about the ugly side of community too. I talk about on the same day, I find a note about my great great grandfather is elected post emancipation. And the book talks about his emancipation from slavery. He becomes a delegate to a presidential convention, and the same day that I read that, I read about a man who's been lynched in the same community. And a lynching, often is talked about as a single act of vigilante justice. The point I'm trying to make is that it actually is an act of community where you have complicity that's happening between law enforcement, between media. Um, and when you have a community that's taking an action like that, you need a community that's going to respond with equal force and determination and intention to say that these are things that aren't going to happen in our sort of community. So I want to pose this, that these things happen here, right? And even the ills that we know took place here are often painted as far and distant, right? So this story takes place in Maryland, as you know. But when I grew up, we didn't talk about slavery taking hold in Maryland. There were people who had been enslaved, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, but we never talked about really the institution of slavery existing in Maryland. We knew it was Montgomery, Alabama. It was the Deep South. But when I did the research for this book, I found out that not only were my ancestors enslaved in Maryland, they were enslaved in my own community, and that my grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. Well, that makes it much more proximate, on the timeline, but much more proximate relationally too. And so, to your point, the way that we've sort of thought about who we are as a country, right, is sort of always up and to the right. And what I think is important and mature and sophisticated is to put in this texture and the context. And it's not to badmouth. I think people sometimes are afraid to have these honest dialogues about who we are and where we've been. But I think it's really important to begin these conversations that are hopefully putting us on the path towards reconciliation as a people, as a country, as a sort of thought experiment. But you can't actually engage in that process or walk that path without rooting it in truth. And that's the stories that you're talking about. That is a violent past, that is a power hungry, that is a wealth dominated, like all of those pursuits are present in our story. And yet there is still beautiful stories of community coming together. There's still, despite that past, there's still this beautiful stories of reconciliation. It shows us what's possible, that we aren't bound by our past, but we can't actually march that path without acknowledging that truth along.
Yeah. Let me get to the next bit of the book here. Grandma Green is my father's mother, but over the years, she and my mother had grown just as close. Grandma was 95 years old and a hard patient to read. We could never really tell how she was doing because she viewed the world with evergreen optimism and never let on about her troubles. Despite her being born Black in 1918, educated and employed throughout segregated Jim Crow years, if I were to ask Grandma the hardest thing she'd ever been through, she would say something like, well, if you believe in God and work hard, everything will work out fine. And then a little later, you say, I grew up close to my grandparents, close to the rest of my family too, sometimes too close. I'm descended from a rural community situated about 30 miles northwest of the nation's capital. So is my grandma. When she came up in the 1920s, and even in the 1950s, when my father was coming up, the community was known as Quince Orchard. Over time, it has gone by different names, but growing up, it was Gaithersburg to me. So you talk a little bit about the journey your own family took not just in geographical change, but the geography itself changed in terms of towns rising, falling, being forgotten, renamed, and so forth. So give us a little insight into the context in which you grew up, which you talk about a little bit in the book, but I'd like to, place your time and place with your grandparents, your parents, the time you grew up, and how that shaped you. Because here you've got a grandmother that says, well, believe in God, do the right thing, everything will be fine. And obviously she went through some very hard times that at that point of her life, she's not choosing to share with you. So just give me a picture of your family dynamic. Who are these people? And I know more than my listener because I've just read your book, but I'd like you to share that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I was blessed to grow up, as you see in the book, on Fellowship. I grew up on a street that's called Fellowship Lane. My grandparents lived at the top. My parents lived at the bottom, and we had aunts and uncles and cousins that lived in between. Sometimes when people ask me, who I am or how I grew up, I say, what you really need to know about me is I'm the product of a public school teacher and a Methodist preacher. And if I get another sentence, I'll say, and a pretty activist grandmother. That combination really shaped my early years. Spent a lot of time with my grandparents. My grandfather, both of which had multiple jobs. So I knew my grandfather as a farmer. He had a pig farm that was right next to our house, and the pigs would often break through the fence and run up the yard into our backyard. But my grandfather was also an exterminator at the NIH, and he was also a builder of homes. He would build houses and gift them to young families so they could have a foundation to build upon. And my grandmother, it's funny, Frank, when we go through life, you sort of assume that you're sort of forging your path. And so when I got to the White House, I was very confident, very proud of myself, and for being one of the first members of our family to get to federal service, to work in the federal government. And then I found a picture at some point of my grandmother in like the 1960s working in what was then the Atomic Energy Service. She had worked for the federal government, then she'd worked in other places. And so my grandmother is just this dynamic woman who worked in federal service. She worked as an Avon lady. Obviously, that's portrayed in the book quite a bit. She served as an Avon lady for about 60 years when she passed. She also worked at National Geographic. And so a dynamic woman full of faith. She spent a lot of time at her beloved Pleasant View. She was the superintendent of the Sunday school for 30 years. And so she cared a great deal about her family. And so I was very fortunate to grow up kind of in the shadow or in the sunlight, however you want to frame it, of all of her penumbra. Um, and then, as you know, my dad was a Methodist pastor. And so I grew up modeling myself after him. In many respects, I wanted to be my dad. I wanted to be a pastor. I would like sneak downstairs on Saturday nights and watch him kind of crafting his sermon and trying to orate and inflect the right way. And that was the path. He put me in the pulpit to be a young pastor on Youth Sunday. And I remember at one point him pulling me aside and saying, you should choose your own path here, because if you go into pastoring, your life will never be your own. And as you know, I sort of chose another path of service, but I grew up emulating both my parents and my grandparents and just looking up to my cousins and aunts and uncles who kind of showed me the way of Quince Orchard.
Yeah, I love the story, and of course I know it a little better than that because I've read the book. But I want to share something with my listeners here. For all my eagerness to escape, I realized I chose a college environment that was pretty similar to what I left behind. Wash U, like Quince Orchard High School, was a predominantly white institution with a similar diversity makeup. I even found my college version of Fellowship Lane in the Irvin program, another tight-knit Black community where, quote, brother, end quote, and sister, quote, and cousin, quote, were terms of chosen family rather than blood relations. And just as Fellowship Lane existed within the broader diversity of Gaithersburg, the Irvin community was a haven within Wash U's wider multicultural landscape. So much for teenage rebellion. I'd pushed mom's geographic boundaries while staying comfortably within my cultural ones. That's sort of a good intro for you to talk a little bit about your journey as an adult. So, post high school, talk a little bit about your academic experience. You talk there about the kind of your relationship to the community, but just give me a thumbnail sketch between there and being in the White House. Again, the story's in the book, but I just kind of want to hear it in your own words.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. And it also reminds me of sort of the lead in before that too, that I was in many respects also eager to get out of Quince Orchard, Gaithersburg, right? Because of the proximity of having my grandparents at my parents. There are a couple of stories in the book about just constantly running into my family and feeling that the pressure cooker of proximity. And so as I was looking for ways to get out of town, college was one of those. WashU was one of those. My path outside of, some people say, what did you major in at Washington University? I often say extracurriculars. And I was very involved in, I wanted to make the student body experience significant. I saw it kind of as a playground, not fully appreciating that it was a bubble in many respects. And so when you kind of navigate beyond professionally, what the book starts to get into is how these ideas, that I experienced on Fellowship Lane and in this merged congregation of Fairhaven, what I experienced with the urban community at WashU and kind of that protected space where Dean McLeod, who was a big mentor of mine, believed that every student should be known by name and by story. You get out into the world, Frank, and you realize that that's not reality. And
Yeah.
so it was really trying to navigate a world that didn't always think that everyone should be known by name and by story, or didn't appreciate the concepts of community in the same way that Fairhaven did, this church that was intentionally integrated in 1968. And so I jumped into politics. I served for the 2004 campaign for John Kerry, and when he lost, I sort of threw my hands up at electoral politics. And I said, like, this isn't for me. And I went to sort of exile myself from politics into Yale Law School, which I learned is a terrible place to be in political exile because everyone there was in some respects political. And as you know, I there sort of was re-inspired to engage in politics, and I found the Obama campaign. But that really, between WashU and law
Yeah.
school, was me feeling a bit in the wilderness and trying to find my way.
Yeah, you have a passage here about Yale, which is kind of interesting. You say, in my first days at Yale, I often felt that law school was an academic maze for which someone was cruelly hiding the map. As a means of lecturing, many law professors use a Socratic method, a style of teaching where a professor would cold call on students to analyze cases through a barrage of questions. Then a little later down on the page, you say, I slipped into the large classroom adorned with opposing pictures of legal luminaries hanging on the walls and tried to avoid eye contact with my professor. As class got started, another student volunteered their hand to brief the case. I didn't know why anyone would ever do that. In briefing the material, the student confidently said, I think the judge got this one wrong. I perked up. What? That's an option? I buried my face in my hands. That rocked me. It hadn't once occurred to me that it was possible for the judge to get it wrong. I had put so much faith into the system, assuming A plus B always equaled C. I thought that was an interesting moment of kind of self-discovery and realization. If you just want to expand on that a little bit, what were you discovering there that was so unfamiliar to you?
Yeah, I think your listeners will appreciate that in this moment, as I was reading the material in preparation for that class, I kept reading the material over and over because the facts of the case didn't sort of lead to the outcome in my mind. And so I assumed that I was done. I assumed I didn't get it. I kept reading the material over and over because I was looking for the errant fact that I was missing that was sort of would have turned the facts on their head for the conclusion that I saw. And when I realized that the system doesn't always follow just the facts to draw to the conclusions, then you realize that there are some real problems with the system.
Yeah.
Right. And so that page goes on to talk about how I felt like I was being taught to present the facts better. But when you have a system that needs correction, like that's where effort needs to be directed. And what sort of was jarring about all of that is like, oh man, if the system is what I've been investing myself in, and the system is what I've sort of been lifting up as something that we can all hold to account and rely on, and that's not working, then why am I even doing this futile effort to try and improve the facts, right? Bad data in, terrible, or even decent data in, bad data out. And so that rocked the whole decision to go, how much value we put in the law, like what is this system actually going to produce for us?
Yeah, I love that passage. I'm going to just jump forward a little bit, read something else, and this is further into the book. And you can give me the context in a minute of this passage. As the days passed, the idea began to crystallize. I wasn't sure my grandmother needed me in the same way her patients had needed her, but I thought I could be there to offer my presence, comfort, and the same quiet dignity she had given to others. I knew we had limited time, and I didn't want to look back with regrets of not having spent enough time with her when I had the chance. I felt fortunate to receive a literal wake up call and was determined to answer it. And I love that passage for a lot of reasons. One is that, if I've learned anything in my 73 years with Jeannie and I being together since we were teenagers and children and grandchildren, it's just what you say here. And, if you could paint this and stick it on a wall, I didn't want to look back with regret of not having spent enough time with her when I had the chance. And every wise person I've ever talked to who has learned from experience, that's the regret you don't want. In other words, it's the human connection or it's nothing in the end. And I've spent a lifetime learning that. So I love that passage in the book. But give me the context. What was it happening in your grandmother's life that made you realize you didn't have that much time, perhaps? And then how did you jump in? And then we'll go to other bits.
It sort of comes back to your question or your point about my grandmother being a hard patient to read. So at 95 years old, she had gotten a prognosis that she had bad circulation in her foot. The doctors had told her to amputate her leg, and she declined. And so pretty much the prognosis was that will take its course. And I think she was comfortable with that. She had watched her own mother's leg be amputated, and so she, 95 years old, felt like she had lived an incredible, long and fruitful life and wanted to leave it intact. And so the irony of that passage, Frank, that you selected, is that I had already felt regret. And this comes across in the book. I remember when I started sitting with my grandmother and she started telling me some of the stories, I ran to my older sister, Keisha, and I said, Hey, did you know these stories? Did you know? And she said, Yeah. How didn't you? And the reality is, my sister had gone every day of high school, walking to high school, had stopped at my grandmother's house and had breakfast with her. And
Yeah.
when I got to high school age, I said, that's the last thing I want to do is go sit with my grandmother before school. And so I missed that moment to sit at her knee and kind of hear these stories. And so I was worried that I had missed the opportunity altogether. And I call it this sort of journey of self-importance, my time off at Yale and in the Obama campaign and at the White House. Some people have said, I need to be more gracious to myself, but I really hadn't been home. And I had been on this pursuit. And so when I got the call from my mom that said, Grandma's not doing great, you might want to go see her. I didn't know that sort of the whole trajectory was going to shift and I was going to engage in a project like this. But in looking back on it, I'm so glad that I did. I'm so glad that I had the time to spend. Now that she has passed, you know, unquestionably, it was the right decision to go and spend the time, collect these stories, and just like cement a beautiful relationship with my grandmother.
I'm going to dive into one of the stories, I guess you could call it, or anecdotes or truths from her own life. But then afterward, please answer this question. And you're younger than me, so you'll remember it and I'll forget what it was. But my question is, give me the context and the story of that time of connection with your grandmother, which again, I know because I've read the book. How consecutive were your visits? How much time did you spend? How did you note her recollections so accurately? Um, there's big passages in the book that are from her, as it were. Now I'm going to read one of those, but then I want you to remember what I've just asked because I tend to dive forward and forget. Speaking of people getting older, this is her. This is her talking about her school days. Grandma would say, "We all walked down to school from the home place together, the older ones carrying the younger ones, like a family on a journey of learning. One teacher would manage 7 grades, all in that one room. She'd teach you and give you an assignment and then move to the next group. That meant you had to be quiet, but Lord knows I love to talk. Her punishment was me writing, 'I will not talk in class,' 100 times on the chalkboard. but the teacher wouldn't let me start writing until she had her lunch, Grandma recalled. That meant no recess for me that day, and I had to write it a lot. Okay, so that's her talking to you, and we're going to get into more of her stories, but just give me the anatomy of your wake up call. Now you are being with her. How did that all happen? How many times did you sit with her? Later on, we have her meeting President Obama. I'm going to read that or ask you to read it. But right now, just talk to me about your trajectory from not knowing her stories to learning enough about her to produce this magnificent book, Too Precious to Lose, a memoir of family, community, and possibility, which is a wonderful book. It's right here. All my dog-eared pages are there. But give me that story. How did you put this book together from your grandmother and spend that time that was limited because she was going to pass away fairly soon after you made this connection? Just give me the story within the story of how that happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you know, I was 4.5 years into being associate White House counsel, and I got a call from my mother that told me that my grandmother wasn't doing well. It was her foot. She's had a history of problems with her foot. Um, and it was, though, as I call it, the wake up call I needed to go and visit her. Now, what I didn't fully appreciate, Frank, until I got there, was I remember that my grandmother used to take me to this place, this facility that she was at. When I was a kid, when I was 5 years old, I would get dropped off at my grandparents' house after school, and my grandmother volunteered there. She had started volunteering there when her mother was there at the end of her life. And so she continued volunteering because it made her feel close to her mother, it made her feel close to the community. And she would tag along, 5-year-old Jason. And my job was to run to the ice chest and get a little bucket of ice and meet her in the room. Well, when I'd walk into these rooms, Frank, she'd be sitting there with someone, often at the end of their life. Sometimes their family had stopped visiting, and she'd give them these gifts of dignity, I like to call them. She'd hold a hand. She'd read the daily devotional. She'd offer one of my little ice chips to them. And she showed me this sort of different demonstration of service, that you can help someone's life be better just by being present. And so when I got back to my grandmother's room and I had the remembrance that this is my childhood introduction to service, I said, okay, God, I get it. I'm supposed to go and sit with my grandmother, hold her hand, right, and offer her the daily devotional and those gifts of dignity. I had to go and negotiate a little bit of time with my boss. Kathy Rumler was White House counsel at the time, and she gave me a little bit of leave. It wasn't much, but it gave me an opportunity to go spend a couple of afternoons with my grandmother. And what sort of struck me was that there was more to capture. There was more to document. And so I came back. I was thinking I would write some of this down, or commit it to memory and then write it down when I got back to my room. I
Mm.
then purchased a little tape recorder, the old reporter tape recorder that would record the conversations. And then it just started building steam. Frank, my grandmother, in her wisdom or in her tire of me, she would say, "Oh, if that part of the story interests you, you should go talk to Miss Ada Howard. You should talk to Miss Johnson or Miss Blair." And so she kicked me out of her hospital room, and I'd have to go sit with someone else. Well, that started to pick up steam. So someone said, if you're going to sit with all these people, maybe you should put a video recording on. So I started taking a camera with me and recording it. And at some point, I got connected to some high school students. And so high school students started coming, and they would film it, and then they would ask questions. And so it really started to spiral. And so the portion that you read is just a combination of, I have the video content of my grandmother direct to camera, in her hospital room with her Afghan wrapped around her, sort of sharing these stories from her past. That's really the context for how it got started, and then how we were able to put all of this content together.
Yeah, no, I really love what you came up with too. Um, as she talked, Graham painted a nostalgic picture of resilience, collective work, and responsibility. It was a community that, despite the dehumanizing reality of segregation, found strength in unity. She would craft pointed portrayals in response to my probing, but the revelations came mostly in fits and starts, like tiny pieces of a mosaic slowly taking shape. Her stories rarely followed a neat timeline. they'd start out in the middle of a church service, jump back to a childhood lesson, and then fast forward to our own children's time. So, that's kind of the story of getting the story. And I just want to turn to the next bit here. And so I'm going to ask you, if you can, to find something in this book that I'd like you to read out loud. If you want to go to page 103, you can tell me when you're on the page.
I'm there.
Okay, 3 or 4 paragraphs down, it starts, "When the time came, I was nervous." Do you see that?
Yep.
And I'd like you to read from there everything to the bottom of page 105 to "Dad extended his hand," and just finish that paragraph. And simply said, "Thank you." Okay, if you'll read those 2, 3 pages out loud, I think it's a wonderful passage of the book. And by the way, a great tribute to your skill as a writer. I mean, I loved the flow of that story. So please read it to us.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you for giving me the opportunity. I miss my grandmother. And so it's just nice to get to think about that time with her again. When the time came, I was nervous, less to take a picture with the president and more to see how my family would interact with him. We had a large group. Most folks are able to bring their parents and a partner. Somehow I had my parents, my 2 sisters, my sister's husband, their 2 kids, and my grandmother in a wheelchair. I met my family at the north gate to help navigate security. I watched as my father proudly pushed my grandmother's wheelchair up the north driveway, past the Marine Guard standing at attention, and into the West Wing lobby. She was wearing a beautiful new black skirt suit with embroidered tan trim that my mom had gotten her. And of course, she wore a matching black church hat with a rose on her right side. Other families were already waiting in line, but we were first on the schedule. Everyone remarked about how large our group was and made space as more family members continued to process through the door. As we paced the waiting room, I could see my 5-year-old nephew, Spencer, starting to get rambunctious. I called him over to me and I said, "I need you to be on your best behavior today. Bud, okay? Mommy said that we're going to meet your boss today. Is that true?" "Yeah, bud, that's true." "But where are we?" he squealed. I squatted down to his level. "We're at the White House. You know I work at the White House." Spencer had more questions. "Does President Obama work at the White House?" he asked as the corners of his mouth started turning up. "Yes." "Is President Obama your boss?" "Yes, he is." I could see his little mind working the syllogism to ask the next and most important question. "Are we going to meet President Obama?" "Yeah, bud, we are." He paused, taking in my answer. Without me having to press him, he assured me, "I'll be good." And then it was time to go in. Guiding the group into the outer oval area, I exchanged greetings with President Obama and introduced him to all the members of my family. "Mr. President, please meet my mother, Miss Rita Green, my father, Reverend Gerard Green, and my grandmother, Miss Ida Pearl Green, who's 95 years young." Grandma was looking up from her wheelchair, her face radiated with joy as the first Black president reached to shake her hand. Determined to stand out of respect, she tried to rise out of her wheelchair. President Obama assured her she didn't need to get up just for him. For a hilarious few seconds, they were in a push of war. Grandma attempting to stand while President Obama gently pushed her back into the chair until she finally relented. Next, the president scooped up my 2-year-old nephew Byron into his arms. Witnessing Spencer and Byron marvel at his presence made us all choke up. Their hopeful, innocent little black boy eyes seemed to grasp the significance of the moment. As the entire family filed into the Oval Office, I gave the quick stats of my starting team. This is my sister, Keisha. She's a family physician. My other sister, Maya, is finishing up her medical residency. The president looked at my parents and said, "I don't know what y'all are serving over at the Green household, but can I get some?" Mom and Dad blushed. I'm a minister for most of my life. My father had always found the right words, regardless of the occasion, whether to inspire me on my darkest day, celebrate the union between 2 beloveds, or send a loved one to the hereafter. Words came natural to him. But this time, glowing with pride, Dad extended his hand and simply said, "Thank you."
Yeah, I love that. And my wife gets up a little later than me, and on a second cup of coffee, I read that out loud to her and genuinely shed some tears. I don't know, that scene just strikes me so powerfully for your writing and the emotion and the family and your grandmother. And then, you know, again, thinking of our situation today, I just got such a powerful sense of missing President Obama as if he was a family member who had passed on. It was like, oh man, I was alive in that time. And I knew some people, not like you, who worked in the administration, but I knew some of his fundraisers. And in fact, I interviewed an author on this program a while back, Matthew Barzan, who had been ambassador to the UK, and he had worked with Obama on some fundraising, small donation stuff. I forget what part of his campaign, but everybody has one memory of him as a man, and it's the memory of the man you just described there. And I really miss him. I really miss him. I just miss the humanity. I never
I
listened to him, and I never walked away from listening to him feeling ashamed of my country. I didn't always agree with him. You don't agree with everybody all the time, but I never felt ashamed. And I forget, when I heard that, when I read that passage out loud to my wife, it was hard to remember. It was like remembering a time before you're sick, and now you have an illness and you're remembering how it felt to be well. That's all I can say.
to be able, right, to be full. I so understand, and just to give you one other memory that's in the book, but speaks to what you're talking about. I remember walking into the Situation Room, and feeling inadequate, right? The significance of that space, the significance of the White House, and I felt like a little gap-toothed black boy that grew up on a dirt road.
Yeah.
And so when I walked into the room, there's a conference room table that's got chairs, and then there's some chairs that are on the outside of the room. And I dare not sit at the conference room table. And I found a chair by the door, and I plopped down in it. And when the president walked into the room, he looked at us that were sitting on the outside, on the periphery, and he said, "Who are you waiting for? Take your seat at the table. We've got work to do." That was him calling us in and being present and lifting us up because there's important work to do on behalf of the American people. And I think that's what you're talking about. Like, I think people are hungry to be called to participate civically. People want to see the country progress. They want to feel involved. They want someone who's going to actually be that drum major, right, with a beat that we can all walk to. And so I miss that too. I miss the inspiration.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I ask it in this book, how do we overcome it? I think that's a big part of it. I also think that um, we can't then be resigned by it. Frank, is the other part. I think that's so important. And that's kind of this doesn't come from Washington to communities. It starts in communities and goes to Washington.
Yeah, and you say something of the kind near the end of the book. Actually, you kind of conclude saying, standing in the cemetery at Pleasant View, someone began to hum, and others joined in, voices rising in impromptu rendition of Amazing Grace, her most beloved hymn. Surrounded by the historic buildings, the generations resting beneath the soil, and the uncovered inheritance now my duty to pass on, the notes of the old hymn seemed to connect the dots that had been guiding my life for more than a decade since I took that leap of faith and left the White House to sit by my grandmother's side. And so, I want to wind this up fairly soon, but I have a favor to ask you when I do. Please, when I sign off in a few minutes, stick around and talk to my producer, Ernie, for two reasons. One, um, just to make sure we can connect to you with links and everything else to help your book along as best we can and whatever you're doing, but also just to chat with him about any other guests you think we should be talking to, friends of yours, associates, family members,
Yeah.
uncles, aunts, cousins. It doesn't matter. They don't have to have all written books or anything else, but just chat with him and see if there's some people we need to be talking to. But let me conclude and just ask about your present life right now, because I love the book and I heartily recommend it to people who want to draw a deep breath of fresh air and remind yourselves what human beings who are trying to be human look like and how they write and who they are. And I want you to meet um, your family. I want people to meet your family. I want you to know Jason Green's grandmother. Um, but talk for a minute about where you're at in your own life right now and how that's playing in the present environment we live in. Um, and just what all is happening with you right now.
Absolutely. One just word on the scene you just described, for your readers, that was my grandmother's funeral,
Yeah,
that you
yeah.
just read from. And that the Amazing Grace, why it resonated so much to me, and it truly was impromptu. It just kind of came up from those that were there at the internment service. It was this: I was blind and now I see, in some respects, and that's a theme that comes through the book. This constant self-reflection, right? We want to see external change, and the best way to create that is through internal reflection, right? Like, it's easier to change ourselves, understand the world better, more deeply. And I think the book is a journey of that for me, inspired by my grandmother, and walking along with her. I should say that it was, you alluded that to a decade. I started this process when she was 95. We were blessed that she ended up living until she died 2 months shy of 107. So I had good time with her. She would ask me, she would say, "How's our project going?" And so
Mm.
we were able to really develop that bond in a beautiful way. So I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to reflect on her and those experiences. And this book is, in many respects, a sort of lifting up of my current day. Before getting on this call, Frank, I was on a Zoom call with the trustees of the Pleasant View Historical Society. I am the newest trustee of that
Mm.
society, and I took my grandmother's position. So when she passed, she was still a trustee. And so the historic site, as folks will know when they read the book, is this is the 3-acre site where the historic Black church, the one-room schoolhouse that my grandmother attended starting in 1924, and the cemeterial plot that, as you read, we were, for my grandmother, we are responsible for preserving that site. It was founded in 1868. It had fallen into disrepair. Some of the work that we've done around this book and around a documentary that I produced have brought new life into that project. And so we're really excited, Frank, and you got to come. In June of this year, we're going to reopen that site. We've restored that schoolhouse. We've rebuilt the church. We've rebuilt another building that was lost to arson. And so we're very excited that that'll reopen. And then on my broader work, I see it as my calling to try and help leaders and communities themselves sort of maximize their potential. I want to see in practice resilient communities that understand how to come together in difficulty, in moments of chaos and conflict, and more importantly, and most importantly, stay together. And I think we do okay, Frank, at coming together, particularly in response to tragic events. But I'm also trying to help or communities across the country instill those democratic norms that are on display in this book about how we stay together, even beyond those moments of coming together.
Well, maybe when you talk to Ernie, if you have some names of people we should talk to that you're working with on these projects, we can do another. I would love to talk to you again, and I would like to sort of plumb the depths of what you've learned just as a person in a leadership position in this effort you're making. Maybe talk to some people about that project. Perhaps we could load the documentary you made about what you're doing up into our channels and show people if it's on YouTube, or find a way to let people know, because it's a good project and I'd like to follow through on it if that's okay with you.
Love it. I would love that, Frank. Happy to follow up, and just so glad to get the opportunity to be in conversation. And your reaction to those passages and others is, you've warmed my heart today.
Well, I had to be careful because otherwise I would just sit and read the whole book out loud to you the way I was doing to my wife at breakfast, but you wrote it. So, and it's always tough interviewing somebody about a book you like because, you don't want to just read the book and you want them to talk about the book and not just the passages in the book. And I think we got a little ways there, but talk to Ernie about coming back in the context of your other projects and let us know how we can plug in and keep helping move this along with the book, and stay in touch with us. If you have ideas you want to talk about, or you have someone we need to talk to, just call Ernie and say, here's something that I think would interest you guys. We would like to really stay close on this.
Would love that. Thank you. And for any listeners, and I'll talk to Ernie on links, but jasongreenbook.com, you can stay up
Excellent.
with me.
Well, we'll do it all. Stick around while I say goodbye here. And much love to you and your family and your child and your wonderful grandmother. And I'm glad she headed for 110. Amazing woman. President Obama was correct. We want to know what you guys all ate for dinner. And living to 110, writing fantastic books, Too Precious to Lose, A Memoir of Family, Community, and Possibility. Jason G. Green. And Jason, I'm glad you did this book because I'm glad to have met you through it.